Okay, so just continuing on from the last video about the conflict in Afghanistan, and I think where I'd left off was talking about civilian casualties and the difference between the Taliban and coalition forces. Now, what I was saying was there have been civilian casualties at the hands of the coalition. Most of those civilian casualties have been in airstrikes which were aimed at insurgents. And like I say, that's absolutely no compensation to the victims to say, oh well, it was an accident. But that's a fact. In those airstrikes, they would not see civilians and say, we're going to target those civilians. Because militarily speaking, it isn't pragmatic. Losing hearts and minds in that way is simply not pragmatic militarily. It's not clever strategy. There has been incidents whereby there have been deliberate killings of civilians by troops. Quite often it's in reprisals, whereby coalition troops have been killed and they've decided to take it out on the local population. But again, in those cases, the troops involved have been brought to trial in their respective countries, whether it be Poland or the US or the UK. Now, I guarantee you the Taliban will never ever try any of their fighters for abusing civilians. They would encourage it. And there's been many examples of the Taliban, for example, deliberately targeting schools for girls and intimidating the local population not to work with the coalition. I think it's very, very difficult for Afghan civilians, because if they do work with the coalition, they risk reprisals from the Taliban, and if they don't work with the coalition, then it's very difficult for the coalition to make progress in those areas and subsequently protect the civilians. I think it seems to me the best option for Afghanistan is to seriously think about a pull-out, but not immediately. There has to be a date in the very near future. I would say a good time would probably be mid-2013 for troops to pull out. Obviously different countries have had their respective timelines. Some other European countries have pulled out earlier. My country, the UK, remains in Afghanistan. There's been word that we could be there up until 2014. I personally think that's a bit too long, especially with the rate of green on blue attacks. That's a serious cause for concern, because if our allies, Afghan troops, are actually attacking us, that indicates a very serious security flaw. I think that there's been notions of having peace talks with the Taliban in some sort of manner, but one thing I will point out about that is a lot of Afghan human rights groups, especially women's rights groups, have been very, very wary about that, because their argument is any peace talks involving the Taliban would mean selling women's freedom. Now, the question then is peace worth that price? Is it worth having a peace whereby women are enslaved once again? Because to have peace negotiations with the Taliban, you would have to have some level of compromise, which would mean giving them some sort of power sharing, which would mean there would be some areas where the Taliban would have absolute power. I think the Karzai administration is completely corrupt, and there's been serious human rights abuses on his watch. It's naive to think that we can have Western-style democracy in Afghanistan, because this really is a very, very tribal society. I've asked Afghans about this, Afghans I know online, what they think the best solution is. They believe that partition may actually be the answer for Afghanistan. Now, I don't know enough about the tribal divisions, the respective tribal cultures, to say whether I think that's the best idea or not. But certainly, long before the US intervention, there was deep tensions between, for example, Pashtuns and Hasheris. This is something that Afghanistan has always faced. It's a tribal society, so no one is going to really respect a central strongman in Kabul. So maybe Afghanistan can only really be governed at a provincial level. I don't know. The reason I say it's wrong to compare Afghanistan with Iraq, the first reason is immediately following 9/11, there was widespread international support for a coalition, an international coalition intervention in Afghanistan, and at that time there was very, very little anti-war sentiment. There was scatterings of it. That's very different from Iraq. The lead up to Iraq, it very much looked like a US, UK, and to some extent Italy, Spain adventure. With Afghanistan, it really was an international intervention. It was led by the US, but there have been troops from literally all over the world. There have been South Korean troops in Afghanistan. There have been Turkish troops in Afghanistan. There's been Georgian troops in Afghanistan. So it's wrong to say it's just a US, UK thing. It really isn't. You may argue they're the largest contingents. But another thing I would argue about the coalition, their job is not principally to engage in firefights with the Taliban. Rebuilding infrastructure from decades of war has also been a priority. Winning hearts and minds has been a priority, and obviously that's backfired at times where NATO have killed civilians, needless to say. But anyone who thinks that a coalition troops' number one job is to just kill the enemy, that's simply not the case. Clearly there's going to be many situations where they are involved in firefights with the Taliban, but actually rules of engagement are not widely known within the public, and they're not actually allowed to fire unless being fired upon. And from my understanding, I think they're allowed to defend civilians, but the Taliban actively engage in attacking the coalition. The coalition will have counter-operations against the Taliban, but their foremost priority is winning hearts and minds and focusing on rebuilding an infrastructure. And it's thanks to the coalition that schools for girls have been opened. It's thanks to the coalition that women have been able to stand as politicians. And actually, coalition support for, Afghan civilian support for coalition is not, it's not actually deeply against that. Again, I'll put up the figures in the captions. I can't, there isn't enough time in this video to look at that in detail, but I'll take time and look at what the actual figures are. But with Iraq, there was widespread opposition to intervention in that country. With Afghanistan, civilian views were a lot more divided, and there's actually remains a lot of deep hostility towards Taliban. That is more in most circumstances than it is against coalition presence. Now obviously when there's attacks whereby civilians have died, then that definitely turns the tide against a coalition presence. But what I'd like to say is it does frustrate me when people say US foreign policy, Iraq, Afghanistan, they're not one and the same. You can't compare them. There are many, many differences between those conflicts. I mean, another factor is the Taliban weren't accused of having weapons of mass destruction, so that factors out of the equation. Afghanistan doesn't have oil, not significant oil. Afghanistan wasn't a continuation of, for example, Bush 1 and then Bush 2 continuing the policies of his father. That wasn't the situation there. So there is a lot of differences. You know, every country is different, every conflict is different. What I would say to people saying we can't win, let's pull out immediately, I would say, okay, well, where will that leave Afghanistan? People might say, well, it's not our problem, leave them to it. But I would argue, well, in that case, that's going to leave Afghan civilians to the mercy of the Taliban. And then the question is that really a wise foreign policy move? to leave Afghanistan in a situation whereby the Taliban will once again have a major influence in Parliament? I really don't know. I don't want to see this conflict go on and on and on. I do think there's serious questions about the conflict as it is now, and I'd like to see a pullout. Hell, I'd like to see peace in Afghanistan. But is peace worth the price of tyranny? Now, a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, I'm a warmonger. I support American foreign policy. I'm a cheerleader for the US." No, actually, I'm not. I think there is a lot of moral questions about the way the campaign has been run. But I get very angry, and I have no patience for people who want to vilify the coalition, but then have nothing to say about the Taliban. Now, the majority of civilian deaths in this war have been at the hands of the Taliban. That's a fact. So if you're going to condemn violence against civilians, then at least get it proportionate. At least condemn the Taliban as well. You know, it just makes me angry that people want to only focus on one side, and they want to pretend like the Taliban are defending their country. I've actually seen people say all the Taliban are doing is defending their country. Well, tell that to an Afghan civilian. The average Afghan civilian, especially women, will laugh at you if you come out with that sort of pro-Taliban statement. And another point, a lot of the Taliban are not Afghans, they're foreigners. So they're equally guilty of invading Afghanistan. A lot of them are Uzbeks, Tajiks. I've even heard of a few Somalis, Sudanese. So it's wrong to say all the Taliban are Afghans. The truth is there really is no easy answers to this very complex conflict. I want to see peace as much as anyone, but I just don't think that an immediate pullout is very pragmatic without really looking at all the answers. I would like to say the best solution would be for the coalition to train the Afghan National Army to an extent whereby they really can look after their own affairs, but before we do that, we have to really look at these green on blue killings, and I think Karzai has a responsibility to really make an inquiry as to how the Afghan forces are being infiltrated. That's a major issue. NATO, for their part, it's no good just saying they regret civilian casualties. I think they have to do a lot more to try and avoid them. But I do think there's a difference. It's just not strategically clever for NATO to target civilians. I'm not saying they never have. There have been rogue soldiers who have done it. But generally speaking, it is not from the top down. You will get these commands, target civilians. That's insane. And if you think it is, I really think you don't know what's going on there. I think Afghanistan is a good example whereby pacifism is morally questionable. Because the alternative to war in Afghanistan, the alternative to a counter-Taliban operation is peace. But peace right now would mean allowing the Taliban to take some level of power, and that almost certainly means a form of very severe theocracy. You may get younger Taliban who have joined for economic reasons because the Taliban offers higher pay than the Afghan National Army, and it may be better to negotiate with them than the ideological hardliners, because some of the younger recruits, from what I understand, have joined, especially the Pakistani Taliban, have joined as a result of economic opportunity. The Taliban basically bribes them, and the situation there then is trying to find them alternative opportunities other than joining the Taliban. Again, that's difficult. There really is no easy answers. I'd like to hear Afghan opinions. If you're going to call me a crusader or an apologist for the Americans, I'd just like to say, well, look at all the issues. The fact of the matter is there is no easy answers here. And I would say just look back to 2001, look at the world in 2001 and look at the reasons why this happened. I don't think there's any easy answers. I think we've just run out of time here.